Look at her, Marcus. Truly, a massive disappointment. My father, chairman of the Allen Corporation, let out a long, heavy sigh, shaking his head before taking a sip of his expensive liquor. He was confiding in the investor sitting across from him, Marcus Vance, but intentionally kept his voice just loud enough for every single word to pierce right through my ears. I built a billion-dollar empire, and my only daughter chooses to hide away in some damn Air Force facility, just to be a useless desk jockey, stamping papers day in and day out, counting supply sheets. A failure? What an absolute waste. Marcus let out a snobbish laugh. He tapped his cigar, throwing a look of sheer contempt at my faded jeans, and chimed in. You cannot blame yourself, Mr. Allen. The military is rigid. A paper pusher will always be a paper pusher. My throat tasted like ash. They were casually dissecting me, trampling all over my pride like it was just idle parlor talk. I bit my lip hard, gripping my hands until my knuckles turned white to swallow the suffocating anger. They had no idea what I actually did for a living. But to buy some peace with my family, I chose to endure it. But the sky, it seemed, was sick of their arrogant little play. Bam! A brutal, out-of-control freefall ripped through the atmosphere. The luxury shattered. No more condescending chats. Only the agonizing screams of billionaires crawling and scratching at the floorboards as the private jet tilted sideways, its nose plunging straight down into hell. The PA system shrieked with the flight attendant's desperate, sobbing voice. The cockpit is full of blood. The captain has a severe head injury. He's out cold. The co-pilot is going into shock. Somebody help. Does anyone on this flight know how to fly a plane? My father trembled violently. He clung to the table leg, that authoritative face from just moments ago, now pale as a sheet, waiting in mute terror for death. While they screamed out of their minds, my nervous system automatically shifted gears. I unbuckled my seatbelt. I stood up calmly. His eyes bulged, mouth opening to yell at me to sit down, but I did not even spare him a glance. No anger, no care for the insults from earlier, no desire to prove anything. Professional instinct wiped it all away. My brain automatically filtered out the screams. My eyes locked onto the cracked cockpit door. I stepped right through the wreckage, moving straight toward the smell of fresh blood. My heavy boots stomped down hard on a piece of paper fluttering across the floor. I glanced at it for a fraction of a second. It was the veteran loan application my father had forced me to sign. Just 15 minutes ago. 15 minutes earlier. The thick stack of papers slid across the polished walnut table. It stopped inches from my hands. Sign it. My father did not look up. He swirled his bourbon. The ice cubes clinked against the crystal glass. A sharp, irritating sound in the quiet, pressurized cabin. I looked down. A veteran home loan application? My name was already printed on the top line. The property address listed was a sprawling multi-million-dollar estate in the Dallas suburbs. A house he would never live in. Just another piece of real estate to flip. Another notch on his corporate belt. I am not signing a loan in my name so you can buy a rental property, I said. My voice was low, flat. He stopped swirling the glass. The air in the cabin grew heavy. You owe this family, Libby. He leaned forward. The smell of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke washed over me. I spent a fortune on your education. I built an empire for you to inherit, and you threw it all away to go play dress-up for the government. You take a taxpayer paycheck. You refuse to work for me. This loan is the absolute least you can do to compensate for your utter lack of contribution to this family. He was exploiting the very system built to protect people who put their lives on the line. He wanted to drain my hazard pay benefits to pad his investment portfolio. It made me sick to my stomach. Marcus Vance, sitting across the aisle, let out a dry, scraping laugh. He tapped his index finger on the table. The heavy gold Rolex caught the cabin light. Come on, Richard. Do not be too hard on her. Marcus sneered, his eyes dropping to my scuffed boots, then up to my faded denim jeans. Without the Allen family credit line backing her up, that government secretary salary of hers could not even buy a doorknob in Dallas. Let the girl feel useful for once. I did not argue. I did not yell. Arguing with them was like screaming at a brick wall. I raised my right hand. I placed 2 fingers on the edge of the application. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I pushed the papers straight back across the walnut surface. They spilled over the edge and scattered onto the plush carpet. My father's face turned a violent shade of red. I turned away. I reached up and pulled the window shade down, shutting out the glaring sunlight. The sudden movement pulled the skin across my back. A sharp, searing ache shot down my spine. The scar. It ran from my left shoulder blade all the way down to my waist. A jagged, permanent reminder of a shattered windshield at 40,000 feet. A reminder of freezing air tearing through a cockpit of holding a dying machine together with nothing but bleeding hands and sheer will. I stared at the closed plastic shade. I reached down between my boots and grabbed the canvas strap of my old olive-drab duffel bag. I squeezed it. I gripped the rough fabric until my knuckles turned completely white. I focused on the pain in my hands to drown out the sound of my father cursing under his breath behind me. He thought I was weak. He thought my silence was submission. He thought my life was nothing but stamping papers and fetching coffee. He had no idea what it took to earn that loan he wanted so badly. Then the floor vibrated. A heavy, sickening thud echoed from the right wing. The engine sputtered. It choked. Marcus's crystal glass rattled violently against the wood. The bourbon spilled, staining the papers on the floor. The memory snapped. Gravity vanished. The floor dropped out from under us. In the present, the screams tore through the cabin. The smell of spilled alcohol mixed with the sudden metallic stench of fear. My heavy boot ground into the wet loan application. The paper tore under my heel. I stepped over my father, who was now weeping on his knees. I left their pathetic world behind and walked straight toward the blood in the cockpit. The drop was violent, a pocket of dead air. The $80 million Boeing 737 hit a wall of clear air turbulence. Gravity simply ceased to exist for 3 horrifying seconds. The silver serving trays launched off the countertops. A platter of roasted meats and expensive cheeses smashed directly into the mahogany wall paneling. Plates shattered, glass exploded. My father was thrown entirely off the plush leather sofa. He flipped backward, his arms flailing before his face slammed hard against the edge of the coffee table. A sickening crack. He hit the floor in a heap of tailored wool and spilled liquor. At the back of the cabin, the heavy-set bodyguards lost their footing completely. They tumbled over each other, a tangle of oversized suits and grunts crashing into the rear bulkhead. Everything was flying, everything was screaming, except me. My body reacted before my brain even processed the fear. I did not scream. I did not reach out for the armrests. I instantly locked my neck muscles, keeping my spine completely rigid against the seat back. Both my heavy boots dug hard into the thick carpet, creating a solid anchor point. I forced air into my lungs. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. Keep the heart rate down. While the billionaires around me thrashed and wailed, my eyes bypassed the chaos inside. I stared straight out the window. The horizon line was completely wrong. A sharp 20-degree tilt to the right. The nose of the plane was pitching up way too aggressively. The G-force hit a second later, pressing down on my chest like a concrete block. The blood drained from my face, rushing straight down into my legs. The plastic ceiling panels groaned. A high-pitched metallic squeal of twisting joints. The smell hit next. The spilled red wine soaked deep into the carpet, stinking of sour grapes and vomit. I kept my eyes locked on the horizon. The engines whined, spooling up way too late. The automated systems were completely offline. Somebody up front was fighting the yoke manually. But it was wrong. The pitch was jerky, uncoordinated. The adjustments were sluggish and frantic at the same time. The machine was staggering through the air. Whoever was gripping that wheel was losing consciousness. On the floor, the illusion of power vanished. Marcus Vance, the man who just spent 20 minutes mocking my paycheck, was crawling on his hands and knees. He was crying. Actual ugly tears streaming down his face as he clawed at the carpet, screaming profanities at the ceiling. "Fix it! Somebody fix it!" He shrieked, his voice cracking like a terrified child. My father was curled up under the edge of the table. He gripped the wooden legs so hard his knuckles were purple. Blood dripped steadily from his chin onto his expensive silk tie. He was not the chairman of Allen Corporation anymore. He was just an old, terrified man waiting to die. Neither of them looked at me. Neither of them asked if I was hurt. My life did not matter to them. It never had. Then the PA system squealed. A blast of static followed by a voice stretched thin by absolute terror. Elena, the lead flight attendant. "The cockpit is full of blood," she sobbed into the microphone. "The captain is out. He hit his head. The co-pilot is going into shock. He cannot hold it." The cabin froze. Even Marcus stopped screaming. The reality of the words sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room. Elena's voice broke into a hysterical shriek. "Does anyone on this flight know how to fly a plane?" The speakers clicked off. My father stared blankly at the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut and started to pray. The man who thought his money could control the world was now hiding under a table from it. I reached down to my waist. I unbuckled my seatbelt. I stood up. The amber emergency lights pulsed. A harsh, rhythmic flash over the wreckage. I unclicked my harness. The heavy metal buckle snapped open with a sharp click. I stood up, shifting my weight to match the violent shudder of the floorboards. My boots crunched over shattered porcelain and crushed ice. I took one step up the aisle. My father's hand shot out. His fingers, trembling and stained with spilled wine, clamped onto the armrest of an overturned chair. Blood dripped steadily from a gash on his chin. It splattered onto his imported leather shoes. He was gasping for air, chest heaving, but the suffocating grip of his own ego still demanded total control. "Where the hell do you think you are going?" he wheezed. He tried to pull himself up, but his knee slipped on the soaked carpet. He hit the floor again with a heavy grunt. "Sit back down," he barked, his voice cracking. "You are just a desk clerk. Libby, stop making a scene. Sit down before you get yourself killed. Even now." Even with the floor dropping out beneath us and the ceiling tearing apart, he had to put me in my place. He had to remind me I was nothing but a useless disappointment. I stopped. I slowly turned my head. I did not yell back. I did not try to justify my actions. I did not care about his bleeding chin or the terror in his eyes. I just looked at him. The amber light washed over my face, but I gave him absolutely nothing. No fear. No daughterly concern. No panic. It was a dead, empty stare. A look built from years of shutting down human emotion in dark, freezing, high-pressure environments. I stared right through him, stripping away the billionaire chairman, leaving nothing but a scared, loud, old man. The air between us thickened. The heavy, oppressive weight of my silence pressed down on him harder than the gravity of the falling plane. His jaw worked up and down. He wanted to bark another order. He wanted to scream at me for disrespecting him. I leaned down just an inch. My voice was low. It held no anger, only the cold, heavy weight of an iron anvil. "Be quiet and stay on the floor." The words cut his oxygen entirely. His mouth hung open, but the sound died in his throat. His fingers slowly released their grip on the armrest. The great Richard Allen shrank back, pulling his knees toward his chest like a frightened child. Behind him, Marcus Vance pressed his spine flat against the mahogany wall paneling. He pulled his legs tight against his chest, clearing the aisle. He would not even make eye contact with me. They were completely broken. Their money meant absolutely nothing here, and they finally knew it. I turned my back on them. I walked straight up the narrow, tilted walkway. A heavy silver serving tray blocked the path, wedged between two knocked-over chairs. I did not slow down to step over it. I hit it hard with the back of my hand. The metal clanged violently against the wood paneling, denting the polished surface before clattering away into the dark. I did not break my stride. I reached the thick fabric curtain that separated the VIP cabin from the forward galley. I shoved the heavy material aside. Vincent Cross, the sharply dressed cabin manager, was backed hard against the small kitchenette counter. Both of his hands gripped the metal frame of the open cockpit door. He was shaking so hard his teeth audibly clicked together. His perfectly pressed uniform was covered in dark stains. His face was drained of all color, pale as a dirty sheet. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling rasp came out. He stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He did not need to say a single word. A thick, heavy gust of air drifted out from the dark space beyond the doorframe. It was the hot, overwhelming stench of fresh arterial blood. I stepped past Vincent and crossed the threshold. The smell hit me like a physical blow, thick, warm copper. The undeniable stench of arterial blood trapped in a pressurized metal tube. The cockpit was a slaughterhouse. The master warning light flashed a blinding, violent red. A piercing, rhythmic alarm shrieked through the small space, hammering against my eardrums. The entire floorboard vibrated violently under my boots, a sickening shudder that told me the airframe was being pushed past its structural limits. Captain Sterling was slumped heavy over the center console. A jagged crack ran up the side of his skull. His crisp white collar was completely soaked, dripping dark red onto the plastic throttle quadrant. He was entirely unresponsive. In the right seat, co-pilot Julian Hayes was losing his mind. His face was the color of dirty ash. His right arm hung uselessly by his side, the forearm snapped and bent at a sickening, unnatural angle. His left hand was locked in a death grip on the yoke, his knuckles bone white. He was pulling erratically. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving in short, erratic jerks. He was in the late stages of physical shock. Then I heard the scrape of expensive leather shoes on the galley floor behind me. I looked up. The dark slanted windshield glass acted like a mirror against the heavy gray clouds outside. A reflection. My father had dragged himself up the aisle. He was standing just outside the cockpit door, leaning heavily against the door frame. He reached a shaking, wrinkled hand out toward the back of my jacket. Even now, smelling the blood, hearing the alarms, his first instinct was to pull me away. To assert his authority. He still thought I was just a clueless paper pusher about to touch something expensive. I did not turn around. I ignored the reflection. I lunged forward and grabbed Julian by the collar of his uniform. I jerked him hard, forcing his wild, terrified eyes to lock onto mine. I did not yell. I projected. I threw my voice from the bottom of my chest, cutting straight through the blaring alarms and the rushing wind. I spoke to Julian, but the words were a direct, lethal strike aimed right at the man standing behind me. "Look at me," I ordered, my voice hard as iron. "I am Major Libby Allen, Pentagon stealth test pilot. I have the controls." For a split second, the piercing alarm seemed to fade into the background. A dull, heavy thud echoed from the galley. 2 knees hitting the hard floorboards. "Test pilot." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The reflection in the glass crumpled. The billionaire chairman, the man who had spent the last 2 hours mocking my worthless government desk job, completely shattered. His entire reality broke apart right there on the wet galley floor. He realized he had just handed his life over to the daughter he despised. I did not look back. I felt absolutely nothing for him. I turned my head slightly toward the doorframe. "Vincent," I snapped. The cabin manager jumped. "Grab the captain by the shoulders," I ordered. "Pull him out of that seat, now." Vincent swallowed hard. He scrambled forward, his hands slipping on the bloody fabric as he hauled the unconscious heavy man out of the left seat and dragged him backward into the narrow hallway. I did not wait for him to clear the doorway. I stepped over the center pedestal and slid straight into the captain's seat. I reached for the 5-point harness, snapping the heavy metal buckles over my chest and lap. I reached out and wrapped both hands around the heavy black plastic yoke. It was warm. It was slick with fresh blood. The nose of the 200-ton machine was pointed straight down at the earth. Julian let go. His broken arm slipped off his lap. His head rolled back against the headrest. The whites of his eyes showed, and a harsh, rattling breath ripped from his throat. He was completely out. The heavy Boeing immediately rolled hard to the right. The nose dropped. The floorboards pitched downward, sending a loose clipboard clattering violently against the rudder pedals. I gripped the yoke. The thick, blood-slicked plastic felt like a concrete block. This was not the hypersensitive electronic stick of a modern test jet. This was raw, heavy mechanical resistance, a 200-ton machine fighting gravity and losing. I did not panic. I did not jerk the wheel. I braced my boots against the floor panels. I dug my left heel hard into the rudder pedal. I clamped my hands around the horns of the yoke and pulled. The resistance was massive. It felt like trying to rip a bank vault door off its hinges. I clenched my jaw. The muscles across my shoulders bunched tight under my thin t-shirt. The scar on my back stretched a hot line of fire radiating down my spine. I counted in my head. 1001. 1002. Waiting for the sluggish hydraulic system to respond. Outside the windshield, the gray clouds spun wildly. Inside, the master caution alarm screamed, a shrill deafening beep that clawed at the eardrums. I pulled harder. My forearms burned. The woman they called a paper pusher, the daughter whose only worth was a credit score, was now deadlifting the weight of their miserable lives. Slowly, the heavy nose began to lift. I kept my eyes locked on the digital artificial horizon screen. The small yellow crosshair shuddered. It stopped its violent descent. It crept upward, fighting through the dark lower half of the screen, finally dragging itself back to the blue center line. Level. The sheer physical pressure on my arms was agonizing. The yoke wanted to snap back forward. I shifted my right thumb. I pressed down hard on the electric trim switch mounted on the horn. Click, click, click. The stabilizer in the tail whined, shifting the aerodynamic load off my muscles and transferring it back to the machine. The heavy column slowly stiffened in my hands. The pressure bled away. The aircraft was flying straight. I took one deep, ragged breath. I reached forward and slammed the meat of my palm against the flashing amber master caution button. The shrieking alarm cut off instantly. The silence that followed was absolute. No alarms, no screaming. Just the low rushing hiss of freezing wind tearing across the nose glass and the steady powerful hum of the jet engines. The chaos was over. I had forced the monster back into its cage with bare hands. Behind me, separated only by a thin curtain, the cabin was dead quiet. I knew Richard and Marcus were out there, holding their breath, trembling on the floor. Men who bought politicians and fired thousands of people with the stroke of a pen, now reduced to pathetic, quiet lumps of flesh, praying the daughter they hated would not let them die. Have you ever felt that suffocating weight? That moment when the people who belittled you your entire life suddenly need you to save them? If you know what it feels like to be the unappreciated anchor of your family, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment below. Tell me about a time you had to fix a mess that someone else created just because you were the only one strong enough to do it. I wiped a streak of cold sweat from my forehead with the back of my wrist. My hand came away smeared with Julian's blood. I ignored it. I reached across the center console. I picked up the heavy black radio headset resting near the throttles and pulled it over my ears. It was time to talk to the outside world. I pressed my thumb against the push-to-talk button on the yoke. Seattle Center, this is Heavy 442. Declaring a medical emergency. My voice was completely flat. Both pilots are incapacitated. I am in the left seat. I need a direct patch to Boeing's Flight Standards Director right now. Outside the cockpit, hiding just behind the galley curtain, Marcus Vance had dragged himself off the floor. He pressed his ear against the thin bulkhead wall, panting. He was listening. He was still waiting for me to fail, still looking for someone to blame. The VHF radio crackled, a burst of harsh static. Then a deep, gravelly voice cut through the noise. Heavy 442, this is Thomas Wright, Boeing Flight Standards. I copy your emergency. Ma'am, before I walk you through the primary displays, I need your name and aviation credentials. Do you hold a private license? I glanced up at the rearview mirror mounted above the windshield. Through the open door, I could see Marcus smirking, waiting for the punchline. Waiting for the government secretary to stutter. I leaned closer to the microphone. I am Major Libby Allen, Pentagon Clearance Code Darkbird, commander of the Experimental Stealth Test Program. The words boomed out of the overhead speaker in the galley. Marcus turned to stone, his jaw locked entirely. The smirk vanished, replaced by an ugly, hollow look of absolute terror. He stumbled backward, his knees buckling under him. He hit the wet carpet with a dull thud. He looked at my father, who was still trembling under the table. Oh my God, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking violently. Darkbird Richard, your daughter is the only person who survived the government's high-altitude G-force trials. She is a living ghost. My father stared at the wall. The color drained from his face. The billion-dollar empire he built, the money he used to control everyone around him, suddenly shrank to the size of a rusted coin. The daughter he treated like a piece of garbage, the one he tried to scam into, signing a loan just to buy another house, was the highest-rated test pilot in the country. He had humiliated a woman who played with death for a living. Over the radio, Thomas Wright let out a long, heavy breath. Relief washed over his voice. Major Allen, understood. Thank God you are up there. I know your file. If anyone can handle a heavy, it is you. What is your total logged flight time on a 737? The air in the galley thickened. Marcus held his breath. He waited to hear the hundreds of hours. He wanted a guarantee that his miserable life was safe. I stared straight out at the endless wall of gray clouds. The corner of my mouth twitched into a cold, cruel half-smile. 0. Dead silence on the radio. In the galley, Marcus let out a pathetic, whimpering groan and buried his face in his hands. I have never touched the yoke of this flying bus before. I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Walk me through engaging the autopilot, Thomas, right now. When copy that, Major, Thomas replied, his voice suddenly tight. Center console, top panel, hit the button labeled CMDIA. I reached out and slammed my finger against the plastic switch. A loud mechanical click echoed through the cockpit. The heavy yoke jerked violently in my hands, then locked rock solid. The computer took over the physical strain. The plane stabilized. I leaned back against the seat. I let go of the wheel. Autopilot is engaged, I said. Good. Catch your breath, Major, Thomas said. The static flared again. But do not get comfortable. I just pulled the weather report for Seattle. It is bad. The ceiling is at 800 feet. Heavy rain. Crosswinds are severe. I looked at the fuel gauges. We did not have enough gas to divert anywhere else. You are going to have to fly her down blind, Thomas said. 800 feet. Thomas repeated over the radio, his voice gritty with static. You are flying blind until you hit the deck, Major. Trust the instruments. I did not answer him right away. I glanced over my right shoulder through the open cockpit door. The galley was still a mess of shattered glass and spilled food. My father was no longer kneeling. He was sitting flat on the wet carpet, his back pressed against the cabinetry, weeping. Silent, pathetic tears cutting through the dried blood on his face. A heavy, bitter feeling settled in my chest. He spent my entire life breaking me down. He manipulated my paycheck. He used my name to buy property I would never see. Yet here I was, stepping into the meat grinder to keep his heart beating. I looked at Vincent, the cabin manager, who was still trembling near the curtain. Pull him into the main cabin, I said, my voice dead and cold. Lock the door behind you. Do not look out the windows. I did not want them seeing the ground rushing up. I did not want my father screaming to be the last thing I heard if this 200-ton chunk of the metal snapped in half. Vincent nodded quickly. He grabbed my father by the shoulders and dragged him backwards through the heavy curtain. The door clicked shut. I was completely alone in the glass cage. Just me, a bleeding co-pilot, and the weather. The Boeing sank lower. The bright gray sky vanished. We hit the cloud layer. Instantly, the windshield was swallowed by a thick, suffocating wall of dark gray soup. The horizon disappeared. The visual references I relied on to tell up from down were completely wiped out. Then the vertigo hit. It started in the back of my neck. A cold, creeping sensation. The fluid inside my inner ear shifted violently as the heavy plane bounced in the turbulent air. My brain screamed at me that the aircraft was banking sharply to the left. It told me we were flipping upside down. My stomach lurched upward into my throat. The physical urge to grab the yoke and violently twist it to the right was almost unbearable. I clamped my teeth down hard on my lower lip. The copper taste of my own blood flooded my mouth. The pain grounded me. It snapped the illusion. Ignore your body. Your body is lying to you. I forced my eyes away from the gray void outside the window. I locked my vision entirely on the glowing blue and brown squares of the digital attitude indicator. The crosshair was perfectly level. We were not flipping. We were flying straight. Reduce speed. Drop the gear. Thomas's voice cracked over the headset. I reached down and grabbed the heavy knobbed landing gear lever. I yanked it out and pushed it down. A loud hydraulic whine echoed beneath the floorboards. Clunk, clunk. The heavy metal doors under the belly opened. The massive rubber tires dropped into the slipstream. The drag was immediate and brutal. The entire airframe shuddered as it slammed into the wall of rushing air. I pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, fighting the sudden resistance just to keep the heavy machine from dropping out of the sky like a stone. The rain started. It did not just fall. It hammered against the thick windshield glass like handfuls of gravel thrown by a giant. "Listen to me, Major," Thomas yelled over the radio, his voice fighting the static. "This is a commercial heavy. Do not jam it into the pavement. You will snap the gear right off. You have to flare the nose before you touch down. Pull it back." I tightened my grip on the yoke until my joints popped. 900 feet, 850, 800. The gray soup tore open. The cloud ceiling broke. The ground violently rushed up to meet the glass. And there it was dead ahead. Runway 16L. It was soaked in rain, slick with standing water, and it looked no wider than a piece of sewing thread. I pressed the red disconnect button on the yoke with my thumb. The autopilot kicked off. A loud, repetitive warning chime instantly filled the cockpit. The heavy machine was entirely in my hands again. A brutal crosswind slammed into the side of the fuselage. The entire aircraft shoved hard to the right. The nose drifted away from the thin strip of wet concrete. I stomped my left boot down on the rudder pedal, throwing my shoulder weight into the yoke to drag the 200-ton beast back to the center line. 100 feet. The rain smeared across the glass. The windshield wipers beat frantically, barely clearing the water. 50 feet. My muscle memory screamed at me. Every instinct forged in high-stress test flights told me to hold the nose down, drive it into the deck, do not float, smash it down, and hook the wire. That was how you survived. You used violence to beat physics. But this was not a fighter jet. This was a fragile hollow tube full of people who despised me. If I drove it into the concrete, the heavy landing gear would snap clean off. The belly would hit the runway, and we would burn. I had to swallow my pride. I had to bury the fighter pilot and fly the passenger bus. 30 feet. "Flare!" Thomas yelled over the radio. I locked my jaw. I pulled the heavy yoke back toward my chest with everything I had. At the exact same moment, my right hand grabbed the throttles and yanked them all the way back to zero. The engines went quiet. The massive aircraft hung suspended in the air for one agonizing, endless second. The nose lifted just enough. Bam! The main wheels slammed into the wet asphalt. The violent impact sent a shockwave straight up my spine. My chest jerked forward, slamming hard against the 5-point harness. I immediately shoved the yoke forward, pinning the nose wheel to the ground. My right hand grabbed the speed brake lever and jerked it back, deploying the air brakes on the wings. Then I hauled the throttle reversers up. The engines roared with a deafening mechanical scream, throwing thousands of pounds of thrust backward against the rushing air. The deceleration was brutal. It threw me forward again, the straps cutting deep into my collarbones. Under my heavy boots, the anti-lock brakes hammered wildly, a rapid, violent shuddering as the rubber fought for grip on the flooded runway. 60 knots. The runway end lights were rushing closer. Red lights flashing through the rain. 30 knots. The heavy shuddering smoothed out. The deafening roar of the reversers spooled down to a low, powerful hum. 10 knots. The plane stopped. We were dead center on the runway. The rain continued to pound against the glass, but the heavy Boeing 737 was completely motionless. There is no feeling quite like proving them wrong, is there? That moment you pull off the impossible, while the people who called you worthless are sitting right behind you, completely powerless. If you have ever had to silence the doubters in your own family with hard, undeniable proof, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below with just one word, "Done." Let me know I'm not the only one who has had to carry the dead weight. I reached over and pulled the heavy parking brake lever. It clicked into place. I let go of the yoke. My fingers were stiff, cramped into hooks. I stared at the rain streaking down the glass. The adrenaline that had kept my heart beating for the last 20 minutes suddenly vanished, leaving nothing but a hollow, freezing ache in my chest. I unbuckled my harness, leaned my forearms on the blood-stained plastic of the center console, and slowly rested my forehead against the wheel. The engines spooled down. A low, dying whine that eventually faded into complete silence. Outside the thick glass, the rain kept hitting the nose of the plane. Muffled rhythmic taps. In the distance, cutting through the weather, the high-pitched wail of emergency sirens grew louder. Fire trucks and ambulances rushing down the wet tarmac. I sat back in the heavy captain's seat. The adrenaline crash hit me like a brick wall. My forearms felt entirely hollow. The muscles in my hands twitched and spasmed involuntarily, my fingers curling inward. Cold sweat glued my hair to my forehead. The back of my t-shirt was soaked, clinging tightly to the jagged scar running down my spine. I did not feel relief. I did not feel the sudden rush of joy people always talk about when they cheat death. I just felt completely, utterly empty. Behind me, the heavy cockpit door was yanked open. My father stumbled in. He did not look at the shattered console. He did not look at the dark pool of blood staining the floor beneath the right seat where Julian was still passed out. He lunged forward and threw his arms around my shoulders. He hugged me. A desperate, suffocating grip. He buried his face into the side of my neck, and the billionaire chairman began to sob. Loud, ugly, gasping cries of a man who had just looked the Reaper in the eye. "I am sorry." He choked out his tears, hot and wet against my collar. "I was blind. Libby, you saved us. You are a hero. I was so wrong. I am so sorry." He was trembling violently. The man who had spent his entire life molding me into a failure, who had mocked my paycheck, who had tried to steal my benefits just hours ago, was now clinging to me like a frightened child. I did not raise my arms. I did not hug him back. I sat perfectly still. My hands rested limp on my lap. I let him cry for exactly 5 seconds. Then I raised my hands. I placed my palms flat against his chest. I did not shove him violently. I just pushed. A slow, steady, immovable pressure until he was forced to step back. His hands fell away from my shoulders. He looked down at me, his eyes red and swollen, searching my face for some sign of forgiveness. He was looking for the daughter who always stayed quiet, the daughter who always took the abuse to keep the family peace. He found nothing. My eyes were completely dead. There was no hatred left. Hatred required energy, and I had none left to give him. There was only a cold, hollow pity. His apology meant absolutely nothing. It was not born of love. It was born of sheer terror. I unbuckled the 5-point harness. The metal clasps clattered against the plastic seat. I stood up. I looked him dead in the eye. "Keep this life," I said. My voice was a flat, gravelly whisper. "And use it well, Mr. Allen." The words hit him harder than the plane hitting the concrete. Mr. Allen. His mouth opened, but he could not breathe. His entire face sagged. The realization crashed down on him, heavy and absolute. He had survived the flight, but he had lost his daughter forever. His authority, his money, his title, none of it could buy back what he had just destroyed. I turned away from him. I reached down to the floorboard and grabbed the canvas strap of my old olive-drab duffel bag. I slung it over my aching shoulder. I turned sideways, slipping past his frozen body in the narrow doorway. My heavy boots stepped over the blood on the floor. I walked out of the cockpit, out into the ruined galley, and I did not look back. The main cabin door swung open with a heavy pressurized hiss. The cold Seattle air rushed in, carrying the damp smell of jet fuel and heavy rain. Outside the tarmac was a chaotic sea of flashing red and blue emergency lights. Ambulances and fire trucks surrounded the Boeing. I stepped onto the metal threshold. My heavy boots crunched over the ruined, wine-soaked carpet one last time. A paramedic team was already rushing up the mobile stairs. The lead EMT, a woman with Sarah Jenkins printed on her jacket, stopped short on the top step. She looked past me into the destroyed cabin, then her eyes locked onto my blood-stained jeans and the faded olive duffel bag slung over my shoulder. "Ma'am," Sarah stammered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Did you put this heavy down?" I did not offer an explanation. I just gave her a short, single nod and reached up, pulling the cold metal zipper of my jacket up to my chin. "Let me through," I said. My voice was low, leaving no room for argument. Sarah quickly stepped aside, pressing herself against the railing. I started down the metal stairs. The rain immediately soaked my hair, but the freezing wind felt incredibly clean against my face. It washed away the suffocating stench of blood, cheap liquor, and broken egos. The deep scar on my back, the one that had ached for hours, was completely numb now. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard the heavy, frantic footsteps behind me. Major Allen, wait. I stopped. I turned my head just enough to look back up the stairs. Marcus Vance had pushed past the paramedics. The arrogant billionaire from 2 hours ago was gone. His expensive suit was torn and stained with vomit. His face was pale and slick with greasy sweat. He stumbled down 2 steps, practically tripping over his own imported leather shoes before stopping just above me. He was trembling. He looked at me not with the condescension of a wealthy investor, but with the raw, naked terror of a man looking at a god. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together in a pathetic gesture of begging. Major Allen. Dark bird. Marcus panted, his voice a sickening, oily whine. I had no idea. Truly, it is an absolute honor. Listen, my firm handles defense contracts, huge capital. I hope we can collaborate on future projects. I can make you a very wealthy woman. He was still trying to buy his way out, still trying to put a price tag on power. I stood perfectly still on the wet metal step. I looked up at him. The flashing blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the sheer desperation in his eyes. I let the silence hang there. I let him feel the crushing weight of his own insignificance. Slowly, the corner of my mouth pulled up into a cold, jagged half-smile. Sorry, Mr. Vance, I said. My voice carried clearly over the sound of the idling emergency vehicles. I am too busy stamping useless supply sheets. Marcus froze. I am just a government paper pusher. I continued, throwing his exact words from the cabin right back into his teeth. I am afraid I just do not have the time to discuss high-level matters with you. His jaw dropped. The remaining color drained completely from his face. He stood there absolutely paralyzed, choking on the bitter, humiliating taste of his own arrogance. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on him. I adjusted the heavy canvas strap on my shoulder and walked down the rest of the stairs. My boots hit the wet asphalt of the runway. I walked straight through the flashing lights, past the screaming ambulances, and past the wreckage of the Allen family's billion-dollar pride. The cold rain beat down on my shoulders, but my spine was perfectly straight. I was walking alone into the dark, but for the first time in my life, I was finally free. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If Libby's story struck a chord with you, please hit that like button, share it, and subscribe for more stories about breaking the chains and taking back your power. Until next time, stay strong, trust your worth, and take care of yourselves. Goodbye.